everybody. This is Dr. Lori Shemek.
And I'm Omar Cumberbatch. You're listening to This Podcast Burns Fat. Hey, Lori, how are you today?
Hi, Omar. Doing great. Yes, doing wonderful. How's life over there in New York?
Oh, everything's great. The weather is kind of changing. I'm excited about Yeah, and I know we're gonna.
Spring.
Yeah, spring is on the way. I think this week is we're gonna hit 60. So that's
That's a
like,
heat wave.
oh boy, from
That
what it's sitting here, geez, no question about it.
that's a cold front where I live.
Oh boy, but
Oh yeah.
yeah, no, so
Spring.
I'm looking forward to it.
The daffodils are coming up where I
Oh,
live
oh, nice, nice.
in
So
Texas. Yeah.
we're moving in the right direction.
I know it. Exciting.
Yeah, so today's guest is super exciting, and I know we're probably gonna get into a little bit of trouble here and there with some of the concepts because it is very controversial, but I ate it up. I love this
It's
guy.
interesting.
Oh, forget it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and his name is Dr. Tom Cowan, and I don't even think I'm gonna get into too much of the detail about what we spoke about. I just want to jump into the show and get as
Yeah.
much feedback from our audience as possible,
Hmm.
just so that yeah, I mean, I want to have him back on, and I know that he opened up so many different, I want to call it controversial topics, that I ate it all up because I love that kind of thought and what he was actually believing in, and yeah, I'm ready to share. I thought he was great.
Hold on to your seats, everybody.
Here we go.
Okay.
Hey, Dr. Tom, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm good. Hope you guys are doing well.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the show. We're excited to have you. You are really Renaissance man when it comes to health, and I was really amazed at all the books you've written, and the subjects that your expertise is on. So, what is there? Could you just maybe give us a little bit of your background and your philosophy, maybe just short version?
Well, I grew up sort of normally. I was,
Hmm.
as I say, I was expected to be a doctor, but I didn't like it. And I grew up in a circle of friends, a lot of whom were doctors, including some kind of famous doctors. The
Hmm.
guy who invented the laser for gynecology, he was one of our good friends. He delivered me,
Wow.
by the way.
Wow. That's
Yeah, with
impressive.
forceps, and maybe that's the problem.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do they use forceps anymore? I don't even
I don't
know.
know. I don't think
Yeah.
so.
Okay.
And a guy who sort of pioneered the use of immunotherapy for cancer
Wow.
until they threw him in prison for Medicare fraud. He was a friend of our family. Anyways, I didn't like it, so I tried to do anything else. But then I found out there was another way to be a doctor. So I decided. Then I was actually interested in the subject and the whole, what is health and how does biology really work?
Hmm.
And then I just set out, and I didn't really know what I was doing, but I set out to try to figure out what, if anything, in modern biology and science and medicine is actually true. And what I realized is that the way to do it is, which most people, including me, didn't realize throughout all these years, is that the way to try to find out what's true is to investigate what's not true and not worry about what is true. That may sound like a mouthful, but
No, but that makes sense, actually.
yeah.
Common sense. Yeah.
In fact, the example I give, which is probably the most important thing for anybody listening, if you want to really learn anything, it's like a guy, 18-year-old, Asian-looking fella. His parents are Caucasian. He's always wondered about that. One day he looks through his parents' closets, finds adoption papers, goes to his parents, says, "Is it true I was adopted and I've never seen a picture of mom pregnant?" "Yeah, we were waiting to tell you," and et cetera, et cetera. So that's true. We got you from a orphanage in China. right? So he goes to his best friend and says, I'm a little shook up. I just found out I was adopted. And the friend says, so who are your real parents? He says, I don't know. I just, somebody in China, I guess. He says, until you tell me who your real parents are, I don't believe you were adopted. Now, that I hope you realize is nonsense, right?
Right.
But I don't know how many times I've said to doctors, scientists, interviewers, there's no such thing as a virus that causes chickenpox. So immediately they say, so what causes chickenpox? In other words, they can't investigate that claim. They can't even entertain that claim. They have to make it a debate. In other words, who's your real parents?
Yeah.
And that way, the only guarantee of that way is that you'll never learn anything. And so I wrote books about the heart doesn't pump the blood. Cancer has nothing to do with genetics. Blocked arteries don't cause heart attacks. Bacteria don't cause disease. Viruses don't exist, or at least have never been shown to exist. ATP isn't cellular energy. The DNA probably doesn't even exist and is not the code of life, and a whole bunch of other things.
Wow.
And all
The
that's just
ATP
because,
and the DNA blew my mind, and the virus.
all
But
because I just look for evidence. If you say the heart is a pump, how come the outflow tube bends in when you're supposedly pumping? Which it does. I mean, you can see that. And that doesn't make any sense. And if DNA codes for proteins, how come there's 200,000 proteins and only 10,000 genes? Like, I guess geneticists are not good at arithmetic. So, all I want to know is, does that make sense? Can you prove to me that that's true? And whether I know what heredity is or why your Aunt Hilda got sick or whatever, that's a different story.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because again, we're speedily approaching a time where a lot of these things are worth questioning, right? Because we just went through what we went through, and I don't think we could say what we went through because, of course, then nobody's gonna listen to this. The algorithm's gonna shut us down. But there's obviously a lot more questioning of what we were told, and we do appreciate you being on the forefront of a lot of this. So. I think that one of the things that I guess the easy segue is there any new like validation for any of the questions that you put forth, or is it where it's not supposed to have answers and we're kind of like helpless to not knowing why any of this is, if you catch my drift?
Well, once you see, so what I've discovered, and again, I didn't know that. No, I mean, nobody taught me this, and I didn't like somehow magically start thinking like this. It was through a lot of mistakes, but what I discovered is if I'm willing to get rid of the nonsense, right? Then it's almost sort of magical. Something shows up to tell me how it might work. And so, what I would say about the answer to that question is that, all these things are sort of like psyops, right? They're psychological operations that have been told to us to keep us in a kind of victim consciousness. Like what the main thing you learn, and I'm a medical doctor, right? And I was an ER doctor for a while, so I am not unfamiliar with the rap, right?
Right.
So we were taught it's never the patient's quote fault, unless they're a dumbass and smoke cigarettes, right? Otherwise, it's genes, germs, or bad luck, or stress, right? That's what gets you. And then we're told there's these specific diseases like Alzheimer's and ovarian cancer and rheumatoid arthritis and measles and chickenpox, etc. And there are these specific diseases that have specific causes. Now, when I investigated those, like rheumatoid arthritis, supposedly caused by an antibody that each destroys your tissue, right? That's what we're told. That's an autoimmune disease. First of all, I couldn't find any study that actually isolated an antibody from a living person. And then I've never seen a study that showed that in what they're calling an antibody that you inject into another animal or person or expose an animal or person does anything. So as far as I'm concerned, that uh, cause claim has been falsified. Now, here's the problem. If you have somebody with their swollen joints and they don't feel well and they have rheumatoid factor, we call that rheumatoid arthritis. But they could have the same symptoms and they have an ANA and we call it lupus. And they could have the same symptoms and they could
Osteoarthritis, yeah.
have osteoarthritis, right? It turns out that, or you know, there's been studies that experienced pediatricians can't tell the difference between roseola, chickenpox, measles, German measles, or any of the other ones, right? And I remember in medical school listening to dermatologists, and they show these slides, and this one is measles, and this one is chickenpox, and we're all writing it down, you know. And I remember thinking, like, what the hell? Like, I can't tell the difference. They're just rashes. So the answer to your question is, what we're told are diseases are always your body's attempt to heal.
Mm-hmm.
No exception.
Or would it also be the elimination of toxins?
Yeah, right. You get poisoned, you excrete it through your skin. We call that measles. Or if it's a different toxin, maybe we call it mumps or chickenpox or roseola or fifth disease. And we're somehow bamboozled into thinking, oh, these are separate diseases. They're not. They're just the body's way of accomplishing something that it can't accomplish otherwise. So that's why we get sick. If you know your arteries in your body are lined with a protective watery gel, if you don't, and that's partly made through sunlight exposure and earthing, being connected to the earth. If you don't do that, you get exposed arteries, and then your body puts plaque on your arteries. And then we come along and say, oh, you have arterial sclerosis. No, you don't. You have a ingenious strategy to protect your arteries from bursting because we don't have cement that we can put in our arteries.
The plaque is what
The plaque is the therapy. And that's why a $50 billion industry devoted to getting rid of plaque, like statins and stents, doesn't work.
So you believe in eating as many eggs as you desire?
I eat whatever natural food. In other words, if it comes from our garden and chickens, I eat it.
Yeah, Whole Foods.
Or Richard's, or Hugh and Hannah's cows, or the milk from the goats down the road. That's what I eat.
Wow, nice.
So, Dr. Taub, I think, and trust me, I'm on board with you 1,000%. I really believe that this is the direction that the more people are understanding of this, the better. But I always hear the argument, and then like I said, I'm not going to belabor this because we got other topics to jump on. So when something happens, like the flu, right, and it's supposed to be a virus that's going to spread around, and you see, like, say, 10 people in an office who have the quote unquote flu, how do they all get it at the same time if there's no such thing as a virus, right? And then again, I'm on board with the terrain theory, but if you can explain that, I think a lot more people would be under the understanding of how this all operates.
Okay, so let's try to dissect what the principle of what you're sorry, of what you're seeing there, and you tell me whether you agree with what I'm going to ask you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So you don't see any virus, right?
No.
You don't see anything pass between one person or another, right?
Correct.
Well, they're
All you see,
microscopic. And
well, you
from
didn't
what?
see it, right?
Right, right.
You have to trust that somebody allegedly saw it. We could get into what they're actually seeing, which is not anything you could call a virus. But let's just stick with this. So what you see, and see again, tell me if you agree, is a bunch of people get the same symptoms at the same time in the same place.
Hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Now we're trying to understand the cause of that, right?
Hmm.
So one claim is that it must mean that something is passed between those people, right?
Hmm.
Okay. So but the principle is if you see a bunch of people get the same symptoms, same time, same place, that means there's a transmission phenomena, right?
Hmm.
Okay, you put 100 rats in your basement, somebody puts rat poison, next day 50 rats bleed to death, and the next day the rest of the 50 bleed to death. Same symptoms, same time, same place. So what you're telling me is that rat poison is a contagious event.
No.
So obviously that observation cannot possibly tell you whether it's a contagious event.
Got it.
So whether
So
there's rat poison or contagion or a virus or some weapon that or something emanating from the wall or something psychological, you have no idea really,
got it.
right?
Hmm. I'm following. Following.
Okay, so in that case, you have to do science, which because you can't tell by looking. So what you have to do is take 10 people, put them in a room with 10 people who are sick, allegedly with the same thing, and then the same room, same environment, same everything, same food, and then 10 people, put them in a room with 10 normal people or 10 people who have cancer or 10 people who have something else. And then you see what happens and you try to control all the variables. So the only variable is, do sick people make well people sick, right?
Hmm.
That study has that I know of has been done about 200 times in the last 150 years. Every single one of them shows that contagion doesn't happen. If you don't believe me, do two things. One, go read a book called Can You Catch a Cold by Daniel Roides, where he documents at least 200 studies over the last 150 years showing that contagion doesn't happen. And then show me a study where they did that and proved that sick people make well people sick. And I've asked, I don't know how many virologists, how many medical doctors, how many interviewers for just show me one study that shows that that's how it works. And nobody has come up with one. Therefore, it is disproven that that is the reason why those people got sick. Now, what happened to them? I mean, they used to have, they were able to demonstrate that children with chicken pox, uh, one of the reasons, not the only one, is that wallpaper used to be painted with some arsenic, Paris green stuff. And children who would go to somebody's house and there was, emanating from the wallpaper this arsenic, they would get a rash that they called chickenpox. Now, the only way you would know that that didn't happen if they went somewhere else, even though there were people with chickenpox, was you do a controlled study and the room wasn't the variable, right? And then you would be able to show that in that case it was the arsenic leaching from the walls. Now, that's not always the case. It could be something else, could be psychosomatic, could be some other shared toxin or something sprayed in the air. I mean, so every situation is individual, which is one of the myths about disease, that these things are specific entities, not your body's way of healing.
Hmm.
That is very interesting. Yeah. What about like bacteria, for example? Is that something completely different? I
And
remember in, history, uh, I believe it was the plague, the cholera or the Black Plague, something like that, where this doctor finally found the cause of people dying, and it was the community water. It was bacteria, and that's how we started to become aware of infectious disease.
First of all, as this guy knows said, history is mostly a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. So that's the first thing about that. The second thing is, so let's try to be like rational and logical about this, right? So unlike viruses, which have never been shown to even exist, bacteria you certainly can find all over the place, in us, on trees, in the soil, etc. So there are different kinds of bacteria. So at least we're dealing with something that we can actually do an experiment on, whereas a virus, because it's never actually been purified, you can't do an experiment, right? If you don't have the thing, if you've never seen a unicorn, you can't do unicorn experiments. But bacteria you can. Now, again, and I don't want to like put words in your mouth, but see if you agree with me on this.
Okay.
The only way you could prove that bacteria cause disease. Now let me back up here. If I said to you, okay, I want to prove that hammers knock in nails, right? A lot of people think that, right? Because you get a hammer, you knock in a nail. So here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to a toolbox, and I'm not going to see if there's a hammer in there. And I'm going to pick the toolbox up and hit a nail with it and see if the nail goes in the wall. Does that prove that hammers knock in nails?
Yes.
I was
Yes.
I was gonna say I know where you're going. I would say no because you didn't use the hammer at this point. You used something else, right? Is that what we're
You
going
used a
with?
toolbox. How do you know it
Yeah.
wasn't the screwdriver or the toolbox? Or
Oh,
Yeah.
assumptions is what you're
you don't
saying.
know.
Yeah.
You don't even know there's a hammer in the toolbox. But even if you knew there was a hammer in the toolbox, I think any sensible person would say, if you want to show that the hammer knocks in the nail, you open the toolbox, take the hammer out, hit the nail with the hammer, and then you could do the motion with your arms so that you know it's not like the air moving through, which it isn't. It's the hammer that did it, right? You don't hit it with the toolbox. You don't, you know, that's, you have to isolate the factor and study it. So
Right.
similarly, like if you drink water and it has a whole bunch of bacteria and it has some slime in it and it has some arsenic in it and mercury and a whole bunch of other things, and you drink it and you get sick, you don't know whether it's the arsenic or the lead or the slime or the fungus or the bacteria, right?
Yeah.
True.
So the only way to do it is isolate the bacteria so that all you have is that bacteria, right? Then you feed it to the person. You don't inject it into their brain. You just feed it to the person in the way that you think that made them sick and see if you can make people or animals sick, right? That would prove it.
Got it.
That seem fair enough?
Yeah. No, I definitely see that. So it's a matter of
So here's the thing. And again, any listener out there who disagrees, there is not a single study in the medical scientific literature that has taken a pure bacteria, exposed people in the normal way, and made them sick, or animals. If you disagree, I don't want to hear stories about 1200, the plague. By the way, one of the places that had the plague, which they said was caused by rats, it was an island. They didn't have rats on the island.
Oh, that's
So the whole thing is a made-up story to make you believe that it was somehow the bacteria, whereas even one of those stories, it turns out they had contaminated the water supply with something like arsenic. So they the bacteria, it turns out, just like bacteria in nature, they eat dead and dying tissue, right? If you cut a tree down and you leave it in the forest, you'll get bacteria eating the tree. You don't say, the bacteria killed the tree, and you don't say the tree has an infection. You
Yeah,
say that the
true.
bacteria are biodegrading the tree. So if your tonsils have bacteria, that's because your tonsils are dying, usually because you're poisoned, and the bacteria just biodegrade them. And if you disagree, you're going to have to show me that you take strep and spray that on a person and make them sick, and I can guarantee that has never been proven.
Wow, so interesting.
Yeah, no, I love
Yeah.
this topic, and I guess the big question now, and of course this is a weight loss show, so I definitely want you to weave in a little bit about that because obviously, as a society is super sick for a bazillion reasons that we're assuming. How do we optimize our health? How do we be metabolically primed to deal with all the issues that we're dealing with today?
So there's 4 reasons why people get sick, as far as I can see. Number one, they have injuries, like they fall off a horse, right? And you break your arm, and that's an illness called a fractured humerus, right? So that's one way. The second way is you're starving, and it could be nutrients. By the way, I'm not convinced that we have even vitamins in us, or hormones, or pretty much any of that stuff. But there seem to be nutrients in food, but it could also be it could be starving for love or shelter or warmth or purpose or a lot of other things, right? So you're not getting what a healthy, normal human being needs to live a happy, healthy life. So that's number 2. Number 3 is probably the biggest, which is you're being poisoned, right? And we're being poisoned by lots of things, like stuff sprayed in the air and people injecting poisons into them. Children have it done 73 times before they're 18, all of which are completely unnecessary, no possibility of any benefit, and contain all manner of toxic ingredients. Those are otherwise called vaccines. So that's another way. Pharmaceutical drugs, poisoned food, lots of stuff, right? So that's the third way. And the fourth way is your delusional thinking. Let me give you an example. I had a guy I knew who was an anthroposophical doctor, and he believed in viruses, even though he didn't know how anybody knew there was a virus or not. So he spent his life working for an AIDS clinic, giving people HIV drugs, which are toxic chemicals. But he believed in it, right? Because that's the way he saw life. And then, of course, because he believes in viruses, then comes the, so-called pandemic in 2020. And of course, he goes out and gets his injections. After the second booster, he's otherwise healthy guy, found dead in his bed, had a stroke. So
No.
the question is, what killed him? Now, you could say, well, it's these injections, and that's true to a certain extent. But really what killed him is believing in viruses, right?
Our actual mindset, belief system.
Well, beliefs lead to actions. His belief in viruses led him to do what would be a reasonable thing, which is try to protect himself against this entity that's going to kill him. So he did what he thought was reasonable, which take a alleged product to help him protect himself against the virus. And of course, it was engineered to hurt people, and it did, and that's why he died. Now, this fourth category I used to downplay, but then I ended up getting some cats, one of whom is named Pumpkin. And Pumpkin and I are good buddies. And Pumpkin, I actually wrote a booklet called Lessons from Pumpkin. And if you want to know how to help people have better lives, here's what Pumpkin has to say about this. So when he can come in and out whenever he wants, right? Because that's, we live in this farmish place. It's like a large garden, and there's woods and gardens, and there's allegedly bears and coyotes and hawks and stuff. So whenever he goes out, he looks around before he goes anywhere, right? And his ears go back and forth, so he's listening and he smells the air and he wags his tail, which I think he's trying to sense the environment. And he does that for like 5 to 10 minutes, and then he goes and does what he does, right? Goes and hunts or climbs trees or whatever. Now, imagine you could tell Pumpkin, and he would believe you, which he wouldn't. Pumpkin, there's a danger out there which you can't see, smell, taste, feel, or sense in any way. But it's a mortal danger to you. What would happen to Pumpkin?
Oh, I love that example.
He
Right.
couldn't, he
Yeah.
would run and hide under the bed, right? Because he doesn't know if the thing is out there, and he wouldn't want to eat because he'd be scared, and he would keep trying to sense, is that thing there? But he can't smell it, he can't taste it, he can't see it, can't hear it, nothing works. So he stops eating, he's hiding under the bed, he's not going outside, and his cat friends say, because he's starting to like lose weight and not feel as good, his friends say, you see, that thing is getting you. And that's where Americans are.
Yeah.
They are hiding under the bed, thinking there's a mortal danger. It's their genes, it's nuclear weapons, which basically don't exist. It's viruses, it's bacteria, it's all kinds of nonsense that they have no sensory ability to know whether it's true, right? They can't see it, they can't smell it, they can't feel it, and so they're afraid. And they live their life afraid. They don't eat right because they're afraid. They get poisoned because they're afraid. And so that's the mother of all that. If you say, why are people sick? Because they're like Pumpkin hiding under the bed.
And so, what is your belief, I guess, about then the makeup of bacteria in the gut? So we know that if you have a lot of diversity in bacterial species and number of them, you have a healthier gut, and healthier gut means a healthier life and less weight gain, et cetera, et cetera.
So here's the problem with that. You see, we have come to believe that all these different bacteria are different species, like they're like rhinoceroses and giraffes and monkeys, right?
Right.
And they don't cross, they don't mate with each other, they don't cross fertilize, and that's nonsense. What there is a precursor, stuff, and it's been called various things, like Béchamp called it microzyma, and Wilhelm Reich called it bionts, and people have called it different things. And the reality is, and you can see these, and you can actually demonstrate that one species turns into another. In fact, even bacteria can actually turn into fungus. They're just different gradations of the life cycle of all that lives in the world. And that is a completely different view of what we're taught. So what you're talking about, there's a certain sort of dynamic living, in our gut. And depending on what is needed at the time, in other words, what the environment is in the gut, then different bacteria will grow or different fungus will grow to sort of meet that need. And and that's why, like, putting bacteria in, like probiotics, is almost always a bad idea, because you can't game this system. It's not just these bacteria or those bacteria as if they're like elephants or rhinoceros or something. It's all very fluid, much more fluid than any of us could imagine, but has been demonstrated for 100 years at least that people could see this transformation. And that's why, when people are healthier, they do have a whole wide variety of things growing in them, and it's all interacting and flourishing like one big ecosystem.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay,
oh,
sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to follow up um, but this ecosystem, like to get to that optimal ecosystem, you would need cultured and fermented foods versus probiotic pills, correct?
Maybe. I mean, I eat cultured food a lot. Like I make
Hmm.
kefir out of goat milk, and I make
Nice.
my own sauerkraut, and I drink apple cider vinegar and all that stuff. So I have nothing against eating cultured food. The way I see it is just helping using the same, bacterial processes to help digest the food so I don't have to do it all. But I
Okay.
no longer think, well, I'm eating such and such bacteria, because I don't think it works like that.
Okay, good.
I think you have to, again, when you're healthy, well nourished, you don't believe in delusional stuff, then and you're not poisoned, you'll have a healthy ecosystem in you, and you don't have to game it much more than that.
Okay.
People make it all really complicated. Well, you got to have this nutrient and that. The reality is there is even such a thing as biological transmutations. That things turn into each other way more than we think. And, that was proven by, like, you take eggs, and you can analyze the mineral content of the egg, right? And then you can
Hmm.
put it in a closed environment, so nothing really is coming in or out. Let the eggs hatch into chicks, and every single mineral that was in the egg is now different amount in the chick before the chick ate or drank anything. Which means, and it's obvious because a chick looks a lot different than an egg, right? One is a gooey yellow thing, and the other is this little fuzzy thing. And so they're obviously made of different stuff. And how did that happen? It's because life is about this kind of transformation. And when we don't appreciate that and we think, these things are fixed, by the way, the whole thing is really because turns out there actually are no atoms in the first place. That is a whole scientific delusion itself.
Oh,
There's no
wow.
there's no
You blew my
electrons.
mind again.
There's no nucleus of an atom. When I say that, people say, "Oh, this guy's really crazy." But then I say,
No.
"So so tell me how they discovered the nucleus of an atom." Do either of you know that?
And I would just assume with a microscope.
Well, you can't see it with a microscope, and that's
Oh,
actually incorrect.
okay.
And so that's the problem. And that's what I've spent my life. I decided that if I'm going to believe there's a nucleus of an atom and an electron spinning around it, I'm going to find out how they came up with that.
Well, don't they have specific types of microscopes for that? I
No,
forgot what they're
there's
called.
no microscope for that. Or if I'm going to say DNA exists and it's a double helix, I'm going to go to the original Watson and Crick paper and see how they came up with that. And I can tell you how they came up with that because they didn't measure anything. They just said they assumed that there's a rotational angle that would mean it's a double helix. I thought, what? Like
Hmm.
you didn't measure anything? Like how do you just assumed because your wife had a vision when she was taking cocaine that this is a double helix? And that's how it got started. And then they got a Nobel Prize, and then everybody has to believe it. And so the way they proved there was an atom is they took a sheet of gold and they shot a light through it like a laser, and 99.99% of the light just went through as if there was nothing there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And 0.001% deflected. And so they said, well, that's the nucleus, and the rest of the atom is made of nothing. Which means, obviously, that because you're made of atoms which are made of 99.99% nothing, right? That's what they just said. And the table is made of atoms that's 99.99% nothing. Therefore, you should be able to stick your hand through the table. Try it.
Yeah. I've
work.
read that before. Yeah. And so what about then that theory, quantum theory, where it's really observation then? Is that kind of what you're alluding to? Something to that effect?
A quantum theory is just a way of bamboozling people into making it sound complicated and profound in a thing that you would never believe otherwise. Like, let me give you an example. The quantum theory now says that they've shown that two things can exist at different places at the same time, right? You've heard that.
Right.
So, of course, I used that and decided, therefore, I could have my house be where it is and at the beach at the same time. And that would save me the trouble of building a new house at the beach. Except it didn't work. Now, I could ask you, you ever seen your dog be at this two different places at the same time?
Not once.
How about a pencil?
Right. Nothing.
And then they say, well, it's only when it gets really small. So, of course, being the smartass that I am, I asked them, when does it go from it's big enough that it's not at two places to then, if it's a little bit smaller, then it's at two places? What's the number that's the dividing line? So they can't tell me the number. And what all that means is when it's so small that it's invisible, then it's at two places at the same time. And the reason is because it's invisible. So how do you know if, like, invisible unicorns are definitely at the two different places at the same time? How do I know? I know because invisible unicorns explode, and that's why the buildings in the Ukraine are all blown to bits, because they're invisible unicorn. And I can prove that because I spread unicorn repellent around my house, and my house is still here.
And what I'm gathering is that is really a theme of yours, is everything that's invisible can't be measured.
Well, how can it be measured if it's invisible?
Exactly. So that's what you're trying to say to the public.
And so here's the problem. They say, well, you have, like, you probably, I don't know, but you probably believe you have estrogen in your body.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
So how did they discover the estrogen?
Well, I guess they measured different, the follicles and the pituitary and all of whatever the estrogen is coming from. But what you're saying is,
no, I want to know they took an egg, they took some of your eggs, and then what did they do next?
They just broke down specific compounds, molecules.
No, I want, like, you mean they put it in a blender?
No, they broke it. Well, they decided to look deeply into it.
No,
under a microscope.
So they took your egg and they looked at it under a microscope and said, "Holy shit, there's estrogen."
Yeah, and they labeled
No,
it.
that is not what happened.
That was how it was labeled.
That's not what happened.
However, they extracted it. And
no, that's what I want to know. How did they extract it?
By looking for it.
How do you look for something like that?
Well, when you dissect anything, when you take something apart or you're looking into it, you can see different components of it.
I can do
And then
that
you
with a
label it.
radio. I can take my radio apart and see if there's a
Right. And
battery
then
in it.
you label it.
Okay,
And then you
so I
label
want to
what you
know.
take
So with the
apart.
radio, I have a radio and I unscrew the back, and then I open the back, and then I see there's a wire, and then I unscrew the wire. So I want to know how they did that with your ovary. Like, what are the steps?
Well, I don't know what the steps
Right, you
are.
don't know, and I'm
Right.
not putting you on the spot.
No,
It's
but
how,
no, I appreciate the questioning, but
the
but
answer is you don't know, and I
well,
didn't know either.
but the
I
thing
just
is,
believed you.
though, when you explore, I guess, especially let's just say the first time they're exploring, they literally don't know what it is that what they're coming across. So they begin to label things that they see over and over again. One of those was estrogen. That's what I would assume.
Right. But so I took it from there and said, I did it with testosterone first because I'm a guy, so it's
Hmm.
more important. Um, and I said, okay, how do they find testosterone? So I got the steps. They take a testicle and they grind it up in a blender, and then they centrifuge it, and then they put it in a differential gradient, and then they mixed it with some chemicals, and then the guy mixed it with acetone 7 different times, because the guy who mixed it with acetone, which is a solvent, 6 times didn't get testosterone. And the first thing I thought of was, wait a minute. So here's this guy who ended up getting a Nobel Prize for this. He's looking at this and he says, wait a minute, this previous guy, he mixed it with something 6 times and he didn't get anything. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to mix it 7 times and that's going to work. And then, but here's the real question. How do you know that mixing a ground up testicle that you put in a centrifuge and filter and mixed it with acids and alkalis and acetone, how do you know that the thing that you get from that process you didn't make and was actually there in the actual testicle?
Yeah,
You know what
exactly.
the answer
Yeah.
is? You have no idea. Because in order to know that, you would have to say, well, I found it and I did a control, so I didn't use acetone and I found the same thing. Therefore, I know that it wasn't the acetone that made this chemical appear. And they can't do that because then they say, well, if you don't mix it with acetone, you don't get the testosterone. In which case, this is a belief, not a science statement. There is no way to control this experiment. Therefore, it is an invalid scientific claim. They have no idea whether there's testosterone, estrogen, insulin, vitamin A, anything in you. Because the only way they can find these different things is to mix them with different chemicals. And every time they mix it with different chemicals, they get something different. I mean, stop the presses, right?
Yeah.
If you mix, the reason they found DNA as a phosphorus-rich chemical was instead of extracting nuclei with sulfuric acid and getting sulfur-rich chemicals, they extracted it with phosphoric acid and they got phosphorus-rich chemicals. I read that and I thought, wait a minute. How do you know it's not because of you did it with phosphoric acid instead of sulfuric acid? Like that may be the reason why you got more phosphorus. Well, we didn't control for that. In which case it's nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we believe it. Now, I'm not saying that ovaries don't do anything or testicles don't do anything. I don't want somebody taking my testicles off. But the idea that it works through this chemical, which has never been actually isolated from a living system, I'm not buying it. And the importance of that is then people say, well, yeah, you don't need your testicle. You just give somebody synthetic testosterone and you get a completely different result.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Fantastic, Dr. Simon. We definitely have to have a part two because you opened the door
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
a lot of things that we'd love to follow up with. I mean, me and Lori are in the chat just throwing questions that we want to follow up with. But I think you're opening a lot of eyes. I don't see how anyone will not be able to run out and get the book that you, especially when the contagion myth that you wrote. I think that's going to be fantastic. But I just want to give you an opportunity to let the audience know where to find all your stuff, your website, social media handles, where to get your books, and anything we could keep up with this before our next conversation. And, I'm sure that they're going to give us more questions to dive in with you. So I want to give you the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, the main website is drtomcowan.com, and I do a weekly webinar on Wednesday that's live streamed. And I also want to put in a plug. I wrote, it was sort of by accident in a way, but I wrote a book called Common Sense Child Rearing that came out just about a month ago. And it's on Amazon. You can also get it from the website, but it's on Amazon. And I have great hopes for this book because there's a lot of tragedies going on, but one of them is with children. And so I laid out a whole different approach to children and child rearing and how to go about doing that. And it's something that, compared to some of my stuff, I think is accessible to just about anybody. And I'm really hoping that this goes into more sort of mainstream, and because we have a real tragedy going on with the way children are raised in this country and the world, not only with the vaccines and the food and the screens and the schools and the rest of it, but there's a whole approach to children which I think is basically toxic. So I really want to encourage people to check that out and write a review on Amazon, and I will be looking forward to seeing that.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, you've been a wonderful guest today, Dr. Tom. So thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate you. All right. Have a great rest of the day.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of This Podcast Burns Fat. We're so excited to have you as a listener, and we're hoping that you really enjoyed the content as well. And if you did, please run over to iTunes and provide a rating and or review. It will go a long way in helping us continuously build our listenership up so that we can provide you with excellent content regarding fat loss, weight management, and just an overall healthy lifestyle. Thanks so much. Have a great night.